might try that myself.
Well, shalom, everybody. And I'm glad everybody's here. And in case everybody doesn't realize it, everybody's being recorded. Oh, everybody got quiet then. Okay. Shalom. Baruch atah Yahweh Eloheinu melech haolam asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'shmoah kol shofar. Blessed are you, Yahweh Eloheinu, King of the universe, who has sanctified us by his commandments and commanded us to hear and respond to the call of the shofar. Oh, yes. Isn't that a beautiful sound?
Yes.
And we're commanded to hear it and respond to it. You see, the Hebrew word says Shema, which means to hear with understanding and the implication of obedience. Okay? And the call of the shofar is the call to worship. I think sometimes people forget. Shema is not necessarily a time of socializing. It's a time when we're supposed to come together to learn, to know, and come to know and to study the Word of Yahweh and let Him direct our lives. Father, as we come before you this day, we do thank you for your word which brings life, your word which preserves life, your word which teaches us how to live, your word, when incorporated into our life, changes our spirit to become in the image of your Son. We can never replace, but we can be like, and that's the yardstick that all of us are going to be measured by, our obedience to your word. Father, we thank you for all things and our salvation through Messiah Yehoshua. B'Shem Yehoshua. Amen. Amen. And the readings today, we're going to be reading in Exodus, starting in chapter 13, verse 17. And we'll be reading through chapter 17 and verse 16. They're coming out of Egypt today. And then we're going to be reading instead of a HAFTARAH, we're going to be reading in the book of Mark, and we'll probably finish the book of Mark today, chapter 15 and 16. Some very interesting things take place in these last two chapters of the good news of Mark. And then after dinner tonight, we'll come back up and we'll get back on, and we'll try to say, if we can, try to keep dinner about an hour. That'll give us a little bit more time to come back up here after we eat, and then we'll get back in and we'll read the book of Esther for a little celebration of Purim, okay? And, we'd talked last week about people bringing stuff, but nobody ever called and said that they knew anybody that needed anything, so we collected nothing, So, but it's never too late. If somebody knows somebody needs something, you let us know, and we'll try to put something together for them, okay? Whatever it is. The Hebrew name of the reading today is Beshalach, which means when had sent. Kind of a hard thing to understand, because in verse 13 it says, "Then it came to pass when Pharaoh had let the people go." The Hebrew actually said when he sent them out. In our English it kind of said, when he had let them go, which means like he really had a change of heart, okay? But in reality the situation was such that he sent them out, kicked them out. It's kind of like he's saying, get out of here before the rest of us wind up dead as well. It was something that he felt like was a necessity. And then as we get into the story, well, that he changed his mind. His heart got hardened again. He decided, boy, that was a dumb thing to do, to let them people go. It's kind of like, why in the world did I let them people go out and serving me? I mean, if you let your slaves go, that means you got to go to work yourself, right? I mean, stop and think about it. A lot of people have people doing things for them mainly because they just don't want to do it themselves. I'm not saying everybody's in that position, okay? But anyway, there in verse 17 of Exodus, Shemot 13, "Then it came to pass when Pharaoh had let the people go that Elohim did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For Elohim said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt." First of all, that land of the Philistines. The word Philistines is a number 6430. The root word is the word Pel Like, I'm just giving you the way it sounded. Pel, P-E-L-I-S-H-T-I-Y-M, Pelishtim. It's a word translated Philistines, but in modern vernacular it's the word that's been known as Palestine, or Palestinian, or Palestine. It's the same word, okay? What I want you to realize, though, is the word Pelishtim means immigrants. Immigrants, kind of like sojourners, immigrants, okay? These people, known as the Philistines, are descendants of Mitzrayim. And Mitzrayim is the name of what? Egypt. I don't know whether people realize it or not, but Yasser Arafat, you know, in modern times, who was supposed to be the head of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation, did anybody know where Yasser Arafat was born? Egypt. Born in Egypt. Isn't it amazing that the leader of the Palestinians, Philistines, those descendants of Mitzrayim, would be led by somebody who was from Egypt? Well, if all these people are descendants of Egypt, my question is, why don't they go back home? Why do they keep trying to create their own state under a different name? Because they already got one. Okay. Go with me to Genesis 10. I just, you know, I'm talking, but I want you to see in Scripture that it says what I was talking about. In Genesis chapter 10. Because there's a lot of people out there teaching that Palestinians are this, the Palestinians are that, and these people are this, and they're Arabs and all kinds of, and, you know, nobody really knows who anybody is, mainly because everybody figures that the genealogies are too boring to read. And we skip over them so fast, don't we? And I say that from experience, don't say no. But in Genesis 10, in verse 6, he says the sons of Ham were Cush, Mitzrayim, Phut, and Canaan, right? So it's, you know, Ham, you know, gave birth to Mitzrayim, right? That's in verse 6. And then look down at verse 13. Mitzrayim begot Ludim, Anamim, Lahabim, Naphtahim. These are all descendants of Mitzrayim. Verse 14, Pathrusim and Cashlahim, from whom came the Palestines and the Captorim. So that makes these Philistines, descendants of Mitzrayim, descendants of Ham, right? Isn't that kind of neat? Isn't it amazing how going back and reading in Genesis helps us to understand what's going on in the world today? I think it's kind of apropos for the time, right? And we need to understand the signs of the times. Okay. So if you go back now into verse 17, it says that he didn't lead them by way of the land of the Philistines. Now, coming out of Egypt up on the north edge, they would have gone through what's known today as what? Gaza. And somebody, you know, decided that they needed to withdraw the Jewish people from the land called Gaza today, you know, thinking that, you know, part of the Palestinians and they were going to have a good democracy. And who did they vote in? Number one terrorist chief. Did anybody tell anybody anything about what the people are, what they want? Okay, I mean, anyway. But here, as he's leading the people out of Egypt, right, these people have been slaves for 400 years. What do they know about doing anything other than what they're told? They didn't know anything about Yahweh. You know, they haven't even been given his Torah yet. They didn't have any idea how to live. They didn't have any idea how to react to any kind of a situation that comes up. When you first come out of the world and you first turn back into Yahweh's Word, you don't have any idea how you're supposed to live or what the Torah is all about or anything else, do you? The unfortunate thing about that is most people start listening to what somebody else says, you know, and without any kind of background in the Torah, they don't know how to check it out to find out whether they got the truth or not. And it takes us a while to realize most of the people have no idea what they're talking about. I'm not trying to come against them. A lot of them good people. They won't know, you know, but they base everything they do based on what somebody else said. And you know how far that'll get you? Not very far. But Elohim knew that the people were new to believing in their Creator. He said he didn't take them up, you know, by the way of the Philistines, although that was near, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war. People come out of the world today, they accept Yahweh, and the first thing that they're into then is a spiritual battle, a war, if you will, and they don't have any idea how to fight the battle because they don't have any idea what their weapons are. That's why I printed out that little thing called, the whole armor of Yahweh. Which, those of you that haven't got a copy, well, get a copy. I didn't make about 5. If somebody needs one, well, we can run some more. And most everybody out in telephone land, you've already gotten all these things, I believe. If not, they're on the website. But they're not ready to engage in warfare. They were not prepared. They don't know how to rely on Yahweh yet. After all, how long have they known Him? And most of everything that they've seen about Him is that He really destroys a whole lot of stuff and killed a lot of people, and He can put you in the dark and leave you there if He wants to. I'm not trying to belittle anything, but what did they know? They only know what they have seen up to this point, right? So, like I said, the question is, are we in a war today? And so many of us are just beginning to come out of the world, okay, and just beginning to learn the Torah, and a lot of us are just now beginning to walk with Yahweh the same as these people are right here. Does that mean that this is apropos for today? Go with me to 2 Corinthians in chapter 10. In 2 Corinthians 10, starting in verse 3. Now this is the Apostle Paul, Rav Shaul, writing to these people, and in verse 3 he says, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh." You see, one of the things that Messiah was bringing, when Yahweh was bringing them out of Egypt, they were talking about war in the flesh, right? They didn't know how to do that. After all, they're slaves. But we're trying to learn war in the same way, and war in the flesh teaches us about war in the spiritual. But he says, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in Elohim for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments, and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of Yahweh." Everything that exalts itself against the knowledge of Yahweh. And you start trying to talk to people sometimes about it being involved in a whole lot of the different festivals and so forth that people celebrate, which is things that they've brought out of paganism. And man, they really fight you on those things, right? But those things are exalting themselves against the knowledge of Yahweh. They don't want the truth because they're happy with the lie. And that is so true in so many other things. And we have to understand when we talk to people what they're rejecting, okay? So casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of Yahweh, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of the Mashiach. See, a lot of people read that and think, well, we're supposed to obey the Messiah. Or is that saying that we're supposed to have the same obedience to the Torah that Messiah had to the Torah? See the difference in those two thoughts? And then people say, oh, well, we just have to obey what Messiah said. Well, Messiah said what? If you're going to be my relatives, you're going to obey the Father. Isn't that what he said? Somehow or other, those things get so misconstrued because people have all these different ideas and they're trying to, present these ideas, and most of them don't make sense anyway, so they just confuse them a little more when they tell you. And by the time you get it, it's like goulash. Anyway. In verse 6 it says, "And being ready to punish all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled." Isn't that a humdinger? You say we want everybody else punished before we really, get straight ourselves, right? You say we want, justice for everybody else, but we want mercy for ourselves, right? In kind of the same way, we should be wanting mercy for everybody, right? But at the same time, we want the truth of Yahweh to be going forth. And we have to live it as well as talk it. Go to Ephesians 6. And we'll read this quickly, but that's the reason why I printed out that little sheet. And this is one of those things that when we first began to get a hold of this, and I can remember back when we were in organized religion, and these people, out there, and they'd be reading these things, and they'd go through this idea of, well, we got to put on this armor, and they'd go through like somebody standing there like a Roman soldier putting on armor. Do you really think Yahweh puts anything in His Word to compare to a Roman soldier? Rome was the enemy, was it not? When Messiah came, everybody here thought He was going to deliver them from them Romans. I don't know whether you've noticed or not, we're still living in a Greco-Roman society. And they're still trying to get us to follow the ways of the Romans. But what he said here in Ephesians chapter 6, starting in verse 11, he said, put on the whole armor of, and that would read Yahweh if you go back into the Torah, that you may be able to stand against the wiles or the schemings of the devil. The armor of Yahweh is to protect you from the devil, right? From Satan. Who is the god of this world? HAFTARAH, the adversary, right? Well, if this world is a Greco-Roman world, then they got Greco-Roman ideas, and that's what you're trying to, he's trying to protect you from. And here he says, in verse 12, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual things of wickedness in the heavenlies. That's where our battle is. We think sometimes that we're battling with some individual, and we're really not. We're battling with the spiritual things that are guiding that individual. And what did they learn from? Same thing we learned from. We got to remember when we're talking to people sometimes, that, hey, we just come out from where they are. And we have to have patience. My goodness, aren't we glad that Yahweh has patience with us? We need to have it with other people. And then in verse 13 it says, therefore take up the whole armor of Yahweh, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. That means having done all is what? If you don't understand what all this other armor is, you don't have any idea of what you've done all. Because most of us have been brought up to believe you don't have to do nothing. Right? Verse 14 is, stand therefore. Now he's explaining to you what you have to do before you can make your stand. Having girded your waist with truth. What is truth? The Torah, the word of Yahweh. Having put on the breastplate of righteousness. Well, what is righteousness? It's our obedience to the Torah. And that's your shield, And having shod your feet with the preparation of the gospel of the good news of peace, right? And what is the good news of peace is? That Messiah has come and he's died for us, that we can be reconciled back to the Father, and then we are reconciled back to the Father. What does that give us? Shalom, peace with the Father, instead of being outcast. Above all, taking the shield of faith. Faith is trust in what? In what Yahweh said. With which you will be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked one. What are these fiery darts of the wicked one? Words coming at you from all kinds of sources, from all kinds of people. Might not even be a lie. It might be just somebody trying to get you to do something, and let you get so involved in that, you put that ahead of Yahweh, and then it becomes an idol. Started out to be a truth, but it became something else. In the wilderness, as long as the people listened to Moses, they followed the path of Moses, which was the words of Yahweh through Moses going the right path. What happens when these people started listening to somebody else? Then they began to turn away from Moses. Then they begin to get in trouble, right? Then they begin to murmur against Moses. Then they begin to murmur against all these things. And we're going to see that as we get on into it even more. But today, people that are teaching a lot of things, that's not exactly what Moses said. And should we follow those people? And I'm not, but anybody that you pay attention to or listen to or read or anything else ought to be teaching the words of Moses. And the thing about it is, you got to know Moses well enough to be able to compare what they're saying against what the Word says. Okay? Verse 17, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit. What is the sword of the Spirit? The word of Yahweh. Nobody else's word. The word of Yahweh. So everything in this armor then has got to do with the Torah, the word of Yahweh through Moses. Everything concerning that, that's what we put on. Well, if this word is what became flesh and dwelt among us, then if we put on the Mashiach, then we're putting on what? The word of Yahweh. And if we got the word in us, and if we got the word on us, and if we're walking according to the word, then in whose image then are we walking? Messiah, Yehoshua. That's the ultimate goal, is it not? Isn't that where we want to be? Okay. So go back. Again, in verse 17, he came to pass when Pharaoh had let the people go, that Elohim did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. He led them not according to the way of the Philistines or the Egyptians or the world, but he led them with him so that he could teach them as they go. The journey is to the promised land, right? And what they're going to have to do is to learn how to walk before they get there so they can go in. Remember, they didn't learn it too well. And when they got there, they didn't believe, right? And it was their lack of faith that caused them not to go in the promised land. We don't want to be that way. Okay? And it said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. Kind of like right now. We see the word, but then we get out in the world, and then we see all these other things, you know. And then the thoughts and cares, desires, and jobs, and money, and food, and all these other things get in our way. And instead of just going back and doing what the word says, we let all of the stuff distract us and pull us away. And we forget, you know. Yahweh is our provider, okay? And he said, seek ye first the kingdom of Yahweh, and his righteousness, and everything else will be added to you. We've got it all backwards because we've been taught that way. So in verse 18, so El, or Elohim, led the people around by way of the wilderness of the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds. And the children of Israel went up in orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt. This one says orderly ranks. Some Bibles use the word harnessed. Some other translations use different word there for harnessed or orderly ranks, you know. The number is 2571. The word itself is the kamushim, which is a form of the word Hamash, which means what? It's the number 5. So it says that they went up in orderly ranks, or they went up in ranks, able-bodied soldiers, arrayed for battle by 5s. It could be that there was 5 in a row, or 10 in a row, or 15, or 20, but it was multiples of 5 of some sort, in columns, okay? They went up, what? They went up in orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt. You'll notice the scripture says they went up. Isn't that amazing? I wonder where they were going up to. They were going on their journey up to the promised land. You know, in Israel, no matter where you are, whether it's north, south, east, and west, if you're going to go up to the temple in Jerusalem, you're always going up. You remember the 15 Psalms? And I think a lot of the headings in the Bible said it was a psalm of degree or a psalm of ascent. The actual Hebrew translation of that is a song of a journey to a higher place. He always said if we walk in obedience to Him, He'll cause us to ride on the high hills, on the high places. We're always going up. When you come out of the world following Yehoshua, you're going to be going up to something. And they went up out of the land of Egypt. But now, there's about, you know, and I know a lot of people have a lot of different estimates on how many people that came out of Egypt, okay? Anywhere from, Scripture said 600,000 men, not counting the women and the children. Plus, it says there was a multitude of others that joined with them. Could have been another, 600,000, right? That's 1.5 million or so. So you got somewhere between 1 and 2 million people coming up out of Egypt. And they're all going by a column of 5 or 10 or 15 or however many there was, as they go up in order. They went out in order. Confusion is not of Yahweh. Okay, that's one thing we always, when confusion comes in, where does it come in from? It comes in from all other kind of discussion that's different from what the Word said. The only way to eliminate the discussion and the confusion is to go back and say, well, Scripture says. And that has to be our source. But they went up by 5s. In verse 19, and Moshe took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had placed the children of Israel under solemn oath, saying, Elohim will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here with you. So they took their journey from Sukkot. See, it's evident then that his bones were entombed there at Sukkot. What does Sukkot mean? It means tabernacles. So they took their journey from Sukkot and camped in Etam at the edge of the wilderness. The word for Sukkot there, the number is 5523. The word is Sukkot. Hey, they put it in there, didn't they? It's the name of 3 places in Israel and 1 in Egypt. I'm just saying that since this is the only one in Egypt, okay, and Joseph's bones was buried there, and they picked up those bones, they took them with them, and when they left from Goshen, and they stopped in Sukkot, and then they left from Sukkot. So evidently, and then now it's after they leave Sukkot is when they have the bones of Joseph with them. So in my mind, that's where they picked up the bones of Joseph to go out. Okay, Etham, the number is 864. Or Atham, A-W-T-H-A-W-M, Atham. The word itself means the house or sanctuary of Tum, T-U-M. Tum, which is another name, a.k.a. also known as the sun god. Another name for Ra. Again, kind of funny. Every place that Yahweh led the people, they're going through all of these places that's been dedicated to all these different gods. Okay? The thing about it is not something that he deliberately did, I don't believe. But let's stop and think about it. Everything in the world that's built by men is dedicated to some god. I mean, you can't go down, you know, through the streets of the city without looking at something that's been dedicated to some god. And we all know about being too long in the sun, and most all of those things are based on following the sun god in some way. So they're all too long in the sun. So if he led us out, we go by these same places that these are going by. Now in verse 21, and Yahweh went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and night. Pillar of cloud, and I think we've talked about this before, but if you just go look this word up, you know, in a dictionary somewhere, you'll find that a cloud, by Webster's, is a visible expanse of water suspended in the air. You see a cloud floating by. No, it's water vapor suspended in the air. But in here, it could be the water of the Word held by the Word of Yahweh. The water of the Word. Remember, this is a pillar. This is a pillar of cloud. It's like a pillar. It's not just some floaty out thing. This thing has shape, right? It performs, it moves, it has function, it has deliberation. It's more than just water vapor in the air. Okay? But he gives us this in order to show us something else. Look how many times Messiah, was received up into a cloud. Here he was in a cloud when he led them out of Egypt. Okay? This pillar of clouds, right, and a pillar of fire was the same thing, right? And the pillar of fire, and what is fire? Fire, according to Webster, is a chemical change accompanied by the emission of heat and light. A piece of wood, when it burns, the wood has to get hot enough to change into a vapor, and then it's the vapor that burns. Wood won't burn until it gets hot enough to become vapor. Vapors are what burns. A lot of times when something gets hot enough that it'll burn, it becomes a vapor. If it's in a compressed area, then it'll explode, and we have explosions. This fire then is often accompanied by a flame, and this flame is what we see is when the vapors themselves begin to burn. Because if you'll notice a piece of wood in the fireplace, it always got a little thing sitting up on top of the wood, and you see the flame, but it's, you know, and then the wood itself begins to become an ash. That's a residue of what's left over. You can't destroy anything, you change its form. It changes from being a solid thing, it changes then into what? Into energy. You can't really destroy anything. Now this fire, you know, and it just consumes everything. And generally, if it's a real heavy fire, the darkness is there and you can see underneath it, you know, or maybe some light above it, but inside the fire itself is really dark. Go to Jeremiah 23. Starting in verse 25. Messiah, speaking through Jeremiah, says, I have heard what the prophets have said who prophesy lies in my name, saying, I have dreamed, I have dreamed. And there's all kinds of people out there saying this, oh, Yahweh told me this, or the Lord told me this, or God told me this, or they're always saying something. You can't really discuss things with people that are always saying, Yahweh told me or the Lord told me. How can you can't, and if what the Lord told them is different from what you read, somebody's listening to the wrong God. Verse 26, how long will this be in the heart of the prophets who prophesy lies? Indeed, they're prophets of the deceit of their own heart. How can you know the difference? If it doesn't match what the Word says, it's not from Him. Verse 27, who tried to make my people forget my name. Oh my. Isn't that exactly what's happening today? By their dream, which everyone tells his neighbor, as their fathers forgot my name for Baal. He said they had forgotten my name and replaced it with Baal. And what does Baal mean? Lord. Verse 28, the prophet who has a dream, let him tell a dream. And he who has my word, let him speak my word faithfully. Nothing wrong with having a dream. If you have a dream, go tell a dream. But just tell him it's your dream. It's not necessarily a word from him. Okay? But then if you have my word, what does he say? Give. My word. And what is that other thing? Faithfully. That doesn't mean don't deviate from it. You don't add to or take away what his word said. What is the shaft to the wheat, says Yahweh? The shaft to the wheat. The shaft is something that's worthless, right? That's what you beat the shaft off of it before you can go eat the wheat. It's just there to protect it until it's time to eat. But in verse 29 he says, is not my word like a fire, says Yahweh. We have this pillar that's leading these people, and sometimes it's a pillar of cloud and sometimes it's a pillar of fire. And the cloud, you know, is water, and water represents his word, and fire represents his word. So we have in this column the word of Yahweh. And what is leading these people? The word of Yahweh. It's supposed to be the same thing leading us. Again, in verse 29, is not my word like a fire, says Yahweh, and like a hammer that breaks the rock in pieces. So my word is like a hammer. If we look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the four Gospels, Matthew means what? The gift of Yahweh, the Torah. Mark means what? Is a large hammer. And Luke means what? Light. And the name John or Yochanan means what? For Yahweh has been gracious. So the gift of Yah is a large hammer of light, for Yahweh has been gracious. And in the four Gospels we have the manifestation of the word of Yahweh in the flesh, just like he said it was going to be. As long as we compare everything back to what Torah says, it matches perfectly. Okay. So if we look at the cloud then as being a spirit of truth, if we look at the fire in it as the power of obedience. Remember, he put Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden, right? And he set a flaming sword to guard the way back in. We read in Ephesians that the sword is the spirit of the word, right? And the flaming fire then, you know, that guards it means the only way back in the garden is through obedience, right? So the power of the fire, you know, would be what? The power of obedience. Obedience to the word. Your obedience to the word, and what happens to other people who disobey, they're going to be consumed by that fire. And the ultimate end result for those people is what? The lake of fire. First time the world was destroyed by water. The last time will be by fire. And yet if we have this water in us, then out of our belly shall flow what? Rivers of living water. I mean, if you just look at how many times he's referenced and how many things he shows and how many times he uses water for destruction, you know, fire for destruction. But yet water can bring life, okay? His word is fire, it can bring life. It's up to us to choose which way we want to go. Go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. I know this seemed like a whole roundabout way of looking at these things, and yet if we don't ever compare the scriptures with scriptures, we won't ever get the full understanding of what he's trying to say. In 1 Corinthians 10, in verses 1 through 6, and Rav Shaul is writing, he says, moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized. That means what? Immersed And immersed, baptismo means what? To make fully wet, or whelmed. They were made fully wet and whelmed into Moshe. That's the word of Yahweh, right? In the cloud and in the sea. Now, when they went down to the Red Sea, where was the water? It stood up. We're going to be seeing it. They didn't actually get wet then from the water that was there. They got wet by the word that was protecting them. And this water stood up and performed a barrier that preserved them as they went through. Going through. The water of the word became a path of life. The Egyptians coming behind them, what happened? That water became death. So it's life to one, it's death to the other. In verse 3, all ate the same spiritual food. Remember, the law is spiritual. All drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Hamashiach, the Messiah, the Messiah. But with most of them, Yahweh was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Those that disbelieved wound up dying. Verse 6, now these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. He goes on to say that there's lusting, and these people that did, they were falling into idolatry. They were falling into all kinds of things that Yahweh said you shouldn't do. Word spiritual there in verses 3 and 4 in the Greek is the number 4152. Again, it's the Greek word pneumatikos.
Would you give us the number again, please?
4152 is the number. Pneumatikos. The actual definition of the word means non-carnal. Okay? Thayers says, one is who is filled with and governed by the Spirit of Yahweh. Filled with and governed by the Spirit of Yahweh. Now Romans 7:14 says the law is spiritual. So if you are filled with and governed by the law, okay, then you're walking in the Spirit. If you walk in obedience to the Torah, you're walking in the Spirit. Now this verse is here in Corinthians says that they all ate the same food, they all drank the same drink, and all of that was the anointed one, Messiah Yehoshua. As they're coming out of Egypt, they're learning about Messiah Yehoshua. Began with the Passover, right? They begin to know who he was. They begin to know who Yahweh is, and he's teaching them through all these things who he is. If they had not experienced these things, they wouldn't have knowledge. Right? If you don't do what he said do, then you never understand why he said do it in the first place. You never come. You may know about, oh yeah, I know there's a God, but you don't know him. And the biggest problem with that is that he don't know you either. Okay? Okay, all of these were fed by the same food, not in the flesh, but in the spirit, referring to the word of Elohim. These little verses that he's talking about, not all talking about what they ate, it's talking about Messiah that they ate. The word of Yahweh is what all these are talking about that. They were surrounded with it, they were immersed in it, they ate it, and they drank it. And for 40 years, that's what they followed. And I said this before, in Webster's 1828, it speaks of the law. Now, if you look up, in Webster, don't look up the word spiritual, look up the word law. L-A-W, law. And in Webster's 1828, it'll give you a definition of the law. And it says, quote, God's law is spiritual. It is a transcript of the divine nature and extends its authority to the acts of the soul of man, unquote. Now, that's talking about what the law is. Go to John 6. In chapter 6, starting in verse 47. Messiah speaking here in verse 47, he says, Most assuredly I say to you, he who believes in me has everlasting life. Remember the word believe, this doesn't mean faith. The word believe means to know and to understand and obey. And if you look all these things up, it's still a matter of doing something, you know. You can believe you're president of the United States all you want to, but don't make it true. Okay? Believing here then is referring to also believing and doing what he said do. And then in verse 48, I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and are dead. This is the bread which comes down from heaven, that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever, and the bread that I shall give is my flesh, which I shall give for the life of the world. Is he preaching cannibalism? Not hardly. But if he is the Word made flesh, and we're supposed to eat his flesh, then what do we eat? The Word that became flesh. You know, the Word that became flesh took place before the commentary of the New Testament was written. So it wasn't the New Testament that became flesh. It was the Torah and the prophets. Verse 52, the Yehudi therefore quarreled among themselves, saying, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? I mean, you know, those people then didn't understand it anymore. A lot of them today don't understand it. Then Yehoshua said to them, most assuredly I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. This is not talking about somebody saying a prayer over a wafer and it becomes the flesh of Messiah. This is not talking about somebody saying a prayer over a cup of grape juice in a cup and it becomes the blood of Messiah. That's not what it's talking about. That is a big distortion which millions of people fall into and have over the years. All of it was symbolic because at the time Messiah did it, he hadn't even gone to the execution stake yet. And it was symbolic. Verse 56, he who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me and I in him. As the living Father sent me and I live because of the Father, so he who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread which came down from heaven, not as your fathers ate the manna and are dead. Not as they ate the physical bread. The whole thing he's saying about is not physical. It is a symbolic thing that he's referring to. He who eats this bread will live forever. These things he said in the synagogue as he taught in Capharnaum. Therefore many of his disciples, when they heard, said, this is a hard saying, or difficult. Who can understand it? When Yehoshua knew in himself that his disciples murmured about this, he said to them, does this offend you? What then if you should see the Son of Man ascend where he was before? Then in verse 63, it is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh profit nothing. The words that I speak to you are spirit and they are life. He's saying you have to eat and drink the word, not the flesh. The words that I speak are life, is what he's saying, right? And they're spirit. Well, if you want his spirit, you have to eat what? His word. It's really kind of simple when you just get down into that, you know, the plain meaning of it. Go to Romans 7. In Romans 7, in verse 14, I quoted this one a while ago, but we're going to read it. Verse 14 of Romans 7, for we know that the law is spiritual, but I'm carnal. So to understand, the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, I am flesh. In verse 14. Now go back to Proverbs chapter 6. You know, Proverbs is right after Psalms. In Proverbs chapter 6, in verse 23, it says, for the commandment is a lamp, and the law is light. Light is what's supposed to guide us, right? That's what, he was the light of the world. I mean, everything that we look at that describes him, it also goes back in the teaching beforehand and talks about him. The commandment is a lamp, the law is light. Reproofs of instruction, the way of life. Now, is he saying then, For the commandment is a lamp, and the law, the instruction for having life, is light. And reproofs of instruction of the way of life. See, that goes back with the meaning of the word law. Instruction for having life. Reproof. Reproof means what? Say, you're going the wrong way, change, you need to go this other way. That's all this word for. That's what it tells us to do. Don't go that way, go this way. If you stay on this narrow path, then you'll wind up where he wants you to go. And if you stay on this path, then you are predetermined to become in the image of his son. If we don't stay on that path, we're going to come in the image of something, but not his son. Go to Matthew 17. In Matthew chapter 17 and verses 1 through 5. We're talking over there in the Torah about, the pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire, and how all these things work and what they represent. And I'm looking at all these other scriptures to get the references in the commentary back against these same things that Torah is teaching us. In Matthew 17 and verse 1 it said, Now after 6 days Yehoshua took Peter, James or Yaakov, and Yochanan his brother, brought them up on a high mountain by themselves, and was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, his clothes became as white as the light. Here he is, a picture of the light that came down. Behold, Moshe and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. Moshe and Elijah, what does Moshe represent? Torah. What does Elijah represent? Prophets. Still the word of Yahweh. The light comes from Yahweh through those. Then Peter answered and said to Yehoshua, Master, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, let us make here 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. Why do you want to build a tabernacle? Because they expected the kingdom of heaven comes at the time of tabernacles. Well, he's a little bit, excited here. Verse 5, while he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. A bright cloud. And suddenly a voice came out of the cloud saying, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him. And if that was in Hebrew, what would he have said? Shema. Hear and obey. But see, again, we're talking about the cloud. I don't think people ever really get the implication of the cloud here in the commentary without studying and knowing about the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire over here in the Torah. Go to Luke 21. In verse 27. And he's talking about, at the time of the end, when everything is, and he and all the saints come back together. In verse 27, then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. How did he go up? He went up in a cloud. How is he coming back? In a cloud. What led the people in the wilderness? A cloud. I mean, we've got to see this connection. Go to Acts chapter 1. I believe that all what people call the New Testament is really a commentary on the manifestation, but that's not to say it's not true. It's not to say that it's, not inspired. But in Acts chapter 1, starting in verse 9, it said, Now when he had spoken these things while they watched, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And while they looked steadfastly toward heaven as he went up, behold, 2 men stood by them in white apparel, who also said, Men of Galilee, why do you stand gazing up into heaven? This Yehoshua, who is taking up from you into heaven, will so come in like manner as you saw him go into heaven. He's coming back in the cloud. Went up in the cloud, he's coming back in the cloud. He came and led the people with the cloud. Remember in Hebrews it talks about we have so great a cloud of witnesses who have gone before you, right? And out of this cloud comes what? The word of Yahweh. Every instance where the cloud appears, what comes out of it? The word of Yahweh. Go to Revelation 10. You're going to be forced to have to get a new Bible one of these days.
You got one.
I know. I'm forced to use it, let me put it that way. In Revelation chapter 10, verse 1. And I saw still another mighty angel or messenger coming down from heaven, clothed with a cloud. And a rainbow was on his head. His face was like the sun, his feet like pillars of fire. That's quite a description. We're going to see that again as we continue to go to the Torah, even today as we look at it. But he's what? Clothed with a cloud, rainbow on his head, his feet are like the sun, or his face like the sun, his feet like pillars of fire. The brightness. Go back to Exodus. Again in verse 21, and Yahweh went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and night. This pillar will lead them through light and dark. It doesn't matter. He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day or the pillar of fire by night from before the people. How long did they wander in the wilderness? 40 years. Following what? The pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire. In chapter 14. Now Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel that they turn and camp before Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, opposite Baal-zephon. You shall camp before it by the sea. Now remember, all the plagues that took place were in Egypt, were they not? So all of the land of Egypt was destroyed. Now Moses has got to lead the people out of Egypt, right? Which means that where they were here was not still in Egypt, fixing to cross over into the Egyptian peninsula. That's still part of Egypt. Everything was, it had to go plumb out. Okay. Well, there was death in the land of Egypt. Go back to Exodus 12 and look in verse 30. Don't just think about the land of Egypt as being one little city where Moses was. Wherever Moses was talking to the people, talking to Pharaoh, whatever city Pharaoh lived in, there was a whole lot more to the whole land of Egypt than just that one city where Moses was. When Moses said it, it was taking place everywhere else. If he was saying something today that covered the whole state of Texas, and he happened to be in one little town somewhere, but it covered all of Texas, just because he's not in your city doesn't mean it didn't happen, right? Notice in verse 30, so Pharaoh rose in the night, he, all his servants, and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt. There was not a house where there was not one dead. Every house in the land of Egypt had at least one dead in it. Even those somewhere who would like to say, well, we never heard nothing about it, they saw the result of it. Didn't matter whether they heard it or not. It happened. You see what I'm saying? People are without excuse. They can find out what took place and why. So again, in chapter 14, they were at Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, opposite Baal-zephon. You shall camp before it by the sea. Now he's telling them where to go. And this Pi-hahiroth actually is Pi-hahirot, C-H-I-Y-R-O-T, Chirot. The number is 6367. Depending on who you read, the name itself has two meanings. Number one is the mouth of the gorges. It's kind of like it's the opening of a gorge, where it runs back into the land, a great chasm, like something could flow down out of that. The other one, meaning is a place where sedge grows. Okay? Sedge is otherwise known as a sword grass. It has long sword-like leaves, like gladiolas, they have the flowers, but they have the sword-like leaves. That's just sedge. That's what this is. Now, it left Goshen. It stopped in Sukkot. And now they're here. This is their what? Their third night, let's say, after coming out, right? Verse 3. Actually, Migdol, did I give you the number of Migdol? 4024, 4024. The word itself means a tower. A fortified city on the border of Egypt. And then they were opposite Baal Zephon. It's kind of like they were on one side of the sea, and then opposite means on the other side of the sea, directly across from them, is this Baal Zephon. Baal is 1189, Lord, and Zephon is 6828. And it means the darkness. So here they were on one side, camped opposite the Lord of the darkness. I mean, if you stop and think about it, there's light and dark. It is a battle everywhere they go. And all the scripture talks about the difference between light and dark. The Lord of the darkness. It also means the Lord of the north. That's kind of interesting when you stop and think about Hasatan, when he decided he was going to be like Yahweh, and he said, I'm going to sit on the sides of the north. Where did he want to be? He's trying to make himself out to take Yahweh's place. So, the word Lord there, Lord Baal and Zephon, the darkness or Lord of the dark, are hidden or dark, but it also has the sense of cold associated with it. It was a place of worship with ancient deities. And this Baal Zephon, there's another name for this god which we've seen in Greek mythology and movies and so forth, and he's called Typhon. Okay? He is also known as the Lord of Winter. And people, we've always seen movies and stuff, where they show this godlike face, blowing and cold air comes out, in some of the cartoons and Walt Disney and all these kind of things, which are so great, and it's the Lord of Winter, this Typhon, Baal Zephon, the Lord of Darkness, cold. Verse 3, it says, for Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel. Now he's telling them what Pharaoh is going to say and think. They're bewildered by the land. The wilderness has closed them in. He said they're down there, they're going to be trapped, they don't know where to go, they're mine. But he's telling them that they're going to be confused by the land. They're going to be lost in the wilderness. He said they're going to surrender. That word closed in the Hebrew, the word for closed is a number 5462. Salgar. It means literally to shut up. In a figurative sense, it means to surrender. They're caused to surrender by the land themselves. They're in the Sinai Peninsula. Not, back over in Egypt. In verse 4, then it says, then I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will pursue them, and I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army, that the Egyptians may know Ani Yahweh. Not just the people that are following him, but all those will know also who he is. And he speaks in advance here of what he intends to do to Pharaoh and all his army. He's telling them before this ever happens what it's fixing to be. And yet when it does come to pass, what happens to people? They get so afraid. They're all scared. All the god of them Egyptians are going to come kill us. I haven't been told what they're going to do, what they're going to think. We sometimes, as we read the scriptures and we know what it says and we know what this word is telling us, but then we get out in a situation, we're faced within the world, we forget all about what the scripture says, and all we can think about is what's being said to us by these people talking to us at that time. And all of a sudden we become so enamored by what they say, or so afraid or something that what they say has got a whole lot more power in my life right at that moment than what the word said. And right at that moment is when we need to call on him for his deliverance from that moment. He delivers us from death, but he delivers us on a day-to-day basis as well. But a lot of times he says you don't have because you didn't ask. He knows what you need, he just wants you to ask. You see, when you ask, you recognize the source. Stop thinking about that. And we don't get it because we're so good. We get it because he promised, okay? Again, he's going to shield his people and destroy the Egyptian army. In verse 5 it says, Now it was told the king of Egypt that the people had fled, and the heart of Pharaoh and his servants was turned against the people, and they said, Why have we done this, that we have let Israel go from serving us? Why have we turned them loose? They were our slaves, now we're going to have to go to work. So he made ready his chariot and took his people with him. He's with them. He's in a chariot. He got all the others with him. Also he took 600 choice chariots and all the chariots of Egypt with captains over everyone. There wasn't just 600. There were 600 of the choice ones, and then all the other chariots that were in Egypt, no matter how many there were. Did anybody ever notice that it was 600 plus? And he said that he had captains over every one of them. The word captains is the number 7991. It's the word Beshalach Lashim. Kind of like the number 3 in Hebrew, right? The word means the third part or the third man. History, usually each war chariot carried 2 men, the driver, and then one was a warrior, the one that did the fighting. Whenever they went out this time and they had this third man in there, then he was in charge of the other 2. His purpose was to keep track of the battle, direct the actions of the driver and the warrior for best effective, so it was like the 3 of them together working as one. And that's what all these things were. And that's what this word captain means the third one, or the third part, the third man. In verse 8, And Yahweh hardened the heart of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and he pursued the children of Israel, and the children of Israel went out with boldness. That word boldness there literally is with a high hand. High 7311 means high, and hand at 3027 Yah means hand. They went with a high hand, or with their hands held high. People raise their hands in triumph, right? And they're going out in a triumph. We have conquered Egypt. They had high spirits. In verse 9, So the Egyptians pursued them, all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, his horsemen and his